Good evening. My name is Janet Sahlberg, and I am the newly elected chairperson of the Toronto Workmen Circle Foundation. Before I begin my introduction to this commemoration, I want to extend my thanks to my predecessor, Marvin Schiff, who has been an engaged and articulate chair, especially at this event in previous years. So thank you, Marvin, from the board and membership of the Toronto Workmen Circle Foundation. I want to welcome everyone to the 81st commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 19th, 1943. This is a particularly meaningful date for many of us because it symbolizes not only the event itself, but it is a yortsayt for those who lost family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins in the Holocaust. In order to prepare these opening remarks, I went back and reviewed the videos of past speakers, all of whom, let it be said, put their own unique perspective on the events of the uprising. The chronology of the Warsaw Ghetto and the uprising are by now well known. In November of 1940, after its occupation of Poland, the German command crammed more than 400,000 Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto and then closed the ghetto to the outside world. Upwards of 80,000 Jews died from disease and famine. 18 months later, from July to September, the Nazis deported 265,000 Jews to Treblinka, 99% of whom were murdered only hours after arrival. On January the 18th, 1943, the Germans marched into the ghetto for the deportation of another 8,000 Jews. They met with armed resistance, battling in the streets and in the hallways. In fact, one of the first Jewish fighters to fall was Avram Feiner, the uncle of Sandy and Harvey Feiner, who are part of our program today. This act of resistance was a preview of what was to come. The final blow occurred on April 19th, 1943, when German, Polish, and Ukrainian military entered the ghetto, intent on its liquidation once and for all. They encountered swift opposition and withdrew, only to return, burning the ghetto to the ground. A month later, on May the 16th, the butcher of the Warsaw Ghetto, Jürgen Stroop, declared the end of the uprising and then issued his famous statement, "The Jewish area of Warsaw lives no more." To most people, that is the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. A daring but doomed battle waged by a Jewish fighting force hopelessly outnumbered, hopelessly outarmed, holding off the full might of the German army for weeks. A story of unimaginable defiance and resistance. But the truth is, the resistance to the Warsaw Ghetto started years earlier. It started with the will and persistence to stay alive, to keep others around alive, to be who you were despite the horrifying and debilitating conditions under which you lived. It started with the social welfare organization, Elaine Health, the Jewish self-help society that ran soup kitchens and house committees, proving the value of mutual aid and group solidarity. It started by bearing witness, writing diaries, poems, and books. It started by keeping culture alive with choral groups and orchestras, theater performances, and poetry readings. It started by offering Yiddish activities to Jewish children with puppet shows and skits. It started by keeping education alive, setting up libraries and schools and printing Yiddish textbooks. It culminated in probably one of the greatest acts of nonviolent resistance to German oppression, the Oneg Shabbos Archive conceived and led by Emanuel Ringelblum. Tens of thousands of documents that were collected and buried in the ruins of Warsaw, documents we know about because of Samuel Kassau's remarkable book, Who Will Write Our History? So as we commemorate the unbelievable bravery of armed resistance today, we should no less commemorate the bravery of embracing life in spite of mass deprivation, of resisting despair in spite of famine and death, of holding on to one's individual and collective humanity. As Jews, we say never forget. Never forget the honor and courage of those who lived and died inside the Warsaw Ghetto, and we say never again. Never again allow such inhumanity to be visited upon the Jewish people. This is our pledge.
Es brennt, Friedensloch, es brennt. Ui, unsere Städten brennt. Diese Winden mit Zirkussen reißen Brennen und zerblossen. Staut noch die wilde Flamme, Hauptsache schon brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt, als sich mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, als sich unser Städtel brennt. Es brennt, Friedensloch, es brennt. Ui, unsere Städten brennt. Som schon die Feierzocken, das ganze Stimmel eingeschlagen. Und die Bässe Winden huschen, unser Städtel brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt, als sich mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, als sich unser Städtel brennt. Es brennt, Friedensloch, es brennt. Es kennen wohl ihre Krumen der Moment. Unser Stück mit uns zusammen, so läuft das schon weg in Flammen. Bleiben so wie noch erstarrt, noch pust der schwarze Wand. Und ihr steht und guckt, als sich mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, als sich unser Städtel brennt. Es brennt, Friedensloch, es brennt. Die Hilfe ist nur in euch allein gewährt. Ob der Städtel ist euch teuer, nehmt die Kinder, löscht das Feuer, löscht mit euer eigen Blut, beweist, dass ihr das kennt. Steht nicht bei der Hand, als sich mit verlegter Hand. Steht nicht bei der, löscht das Feuer, unser Städtel brennt.
Kommes, Haynt is yortsayt. Yortsayt, Haynt, a Zind. Wenn gerufen hat zu dir ein erstgeboren Kind. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Schmeichel über Wald und Plain. Jeder hat Haynt yortsayt, noch sein Schwell, noch sich allein. Haynt is yortsayt noch ein Regen 1943, noch ein letzten Karschenbäum und Schwellballe dabei. Haynt is yortsayt noch mein Zeit, verfreuren in Ponar. Haynt is yortsayt noch mein Mames gellen Samovar. Noch ein Schnee von meiner Weißlein ausgeschneit, beschaß, ich hab zugedeckt mit dem Käfer von mein Gas. Heint ist Yortsayt noch die 2 Malochen bei mein Bett. Heint ist Yortsayt noch ein Zoffenstern ergetät. Yortsayt noch ein Spiegel mit einem bläuen Teich im Rahmen, wo es bäumten sich die Licht und Schottens von mein Stamm. Heint ist Yortsayt noch ein Schabbes, rein wie ein Brillant. Heint ist Yortsayt noch der Fiddle in mein Chavers Hand. Heint ist Yortsayt noch ein Leib in Friedigen und Bläus. Heint ist Yortsayt noch der letzte Yortsayt-Licht in Kleus. Yortsayt noch einen langen Säger auf der Wand von Lehm. Oi, noch alle Wieglieder von unser Irrwein.
Today is yortsayt. God of vengeance, today is yortsayt. Today we mourn the day you were summoned by your firstborn. Today we mourn a smile which covered dell and wood. Today we mourn ourselves, our home and neighborhood. Today I mourn the rain in 1943, the last little swallow in the nearby cherry tree. Today I mark my time frozen in Pinar. Today I remember my mama's yellow samovar. The snow which the whites of my eyes have shed and which covered my street, now the graves of my dead. Today I mourn the 2 angels by my bed and the North Star somewhere overhead. I mourn the mirror with its lake blue frame, where bathe the light and shadows of my roots, my name. Today I mourn a Sabbath pristine and grand. Today I mourn the fiddle in my comrade's hand. Yortsayt for a body joyously in bloom, and for the last votive in the shul's small room. It's yortsayt for the tall clock upon the whitewashed wall, and for every lullaby of generations all.
A summons to remember. On the first Seder night in April 1943, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto took up arms against their Nazi overlords. It was the beginning of an epic battle, not for victory as the resistance fighters knew from the outset, but for the honor of their people. On the walls of the ghetto, they posted an 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not despair." It was their watchword and their legacy. When the battle was near its end, the few Jews who still survived issued an appeal to their brethren around the world. Remember us. Do not forget what we have suffered at the hands of our murderous enemy. Let our departure from the world in ashes and in smoke not be in vain. The Battle of the Ghetto glows in Jewish history. It is immortalized in scores of writings and sanctified in the annals of the human spirit. It has nourished the will of new generations to renew and fortify their national and cultural heritage. We will forever remember the fighters who fell in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Ayer, heylikn, zikorn. Alle meine Tag seien Yortsayt-Licht, Ayer, heylikn, zikorn. Und alle Nacht mit Sewe-Stimme auf eure verschämte Quorum. Durch Berg von Asch und Räucherschwarze, ich gehe zu euch von Stadt zu Stadt. Und sie ist durchschlagen von mein Herzen, das Wiederkoll von euer letzten Trott. Nur wo soll ich sein Spur jetzt suchen? Auf welche Stichen? Als alle Wegen hab meier Pein getragen und euer Blut hat die ganze Erde gezwungen. Jeden Menschen kommt 7 Tage von Treue. Wie viel Jahren soll mein Treuer dauern, kedei zu sitzen Schive noch Millionen, a Volk a ganz in Wettig zu dermonnen. Seien alle meine Tage die Yortsayt-Licht, Ayer, heylikn, zikorn, und alle Nacht mit Sewe-Stimme auf eure verschämte Quorum.
Zygelboim was elected to the Warsaw City Council in 1927. During the first months of the Nazi occupation in Poland, he was a key figure in the underground resistance movement in Warsaw. He was sent to Europe and North America to raise awareness of what was happening to the Jews of Poland. However, his audience was incredulous or indifferent. Even as the Nazis were liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto, his pleas fell on deaf ears. 2023 is the 80th anniversary of his death and his final testament on behalf of our people. Ich kann nicht bleiben still. Ich kann nicht leben, wenn die Rechtslach von jüdischen Volk in Polen, demens Vorsteher ich bin, werden umgebracht. Meine Chaverim in Warsaw Ghetto seien umgekommen mit Gewehr in Hand in dem letzten heroischen Gerangel. Ich gehöre zu sie und sehr Massenquoren. Mit mein Tod will ich ausdrücken den stärksten Protest gegen der Passivkeit, mit welcher die Welt guckt sich zu und erlässt die Ausrottung vom jüdischen Volk. Mein Leben gehört zum jüdischen Volk in Polen und dafür gebe ich es ihm weg.
When was it sealed? When was it decreed? Your great, your wonderful, deathless deed? Did it come to you like a child in your dream? Or did a dark messenger bring you the tale in your London exile? Did the messenger come to your door and knock? A woman heavily shrouded in black? I come for the Warsaw Ghetto where the earth is on fire, her clothes and rags a tattered shroud, and her lips red with blood. Then you knocked at doors and found hearts that were closed. You tried to rouse them, but they wouldn't be roused. What people are those who refused to listen when children were gassed and flung on the mound and no one raised a hand? You carry round stacks of papers to show. You may be right, they said, but how can we know? We want to believe you, but these are not facts, and we are bound by conventions and acts. You brought out a list of the dead. How can you prove they are dead, they say. So to convince them, you added your name to the list. You always gave proofs, like a realist. One May night, when the orchards ripened in the land, and spring walked around with stars hand in hand, one window on a London street showed a light. That was you sitting down alone to write. You wrote your last letters and your last testament for the dawn to read before the night was spent. Then a shot rang out, a single shot to wipe out the shame of which you wrote. You died to make the world listen to the cry from the Warsaw Ghetto across the sky.
Farvos ist der Himmel gewesen, Leute von Frieden hat gescheint hier der Gas. Farvos ist die Sonne, als liebte Geräute, verknuret heint bis und im Kass. Farvos ist die Sonne, als liebte Geräute, verknuret heint bis und im Kass. Es weht heint der Himmel, das Haus und das Gessel, es treuert das Haupt still erhebt. Sie können vergessen, wie können vergessen, vergangener Schoen von Fried. Sie können vergessen, wie können vergessen, vergangener Schoen von Fried. das Morgen wird tief scheinen Sonn auf das Nei.
Let me begin this introduction of our guest speaker by reminding you of the words I said earlier: never forget and never again. Those words have taken on new meaning after the events of October 7th, events which have shaken our world and changed the political and social landscape for Canadian Jews from coast to coast. That's why I'm so pleased to have Anthony Housefather speak to us. As a result of October 7th, antisemitism is rising in Canada, and Anthony is uniquely placed to inform us with his expertise and perspective. Anthony Housefather was first elected as the Member of Parliament for Mount Royal on October 19, 2015, and is currently the Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board. Anthony sits as a member of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. He is the chair of the Canada-Israel Parliamentary Friendship Group, as well as the co-chair of the International Task Force on Online Antisemitism. The Workmen Circle is pleased and honored to welcome one of the most outspoken advocates for Canadian Jews, Anthony Housefather.
I am so glad to join with you at the Workmen Circle on this 81st anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In 1943, when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happened, Europe was at a point where Jews had essentially been eradicated from most of the countries, other than Hungary. Deportations had started. Jews were in concentration camps. Jews were in work camps, and Jews had been massacred at Treblinka, at Auschwitz, and by the Einsatzgruppen in places like Kiev in the Ukraine. This is not a good story. It's a story of how a horrible regime convinced Europeans across the board, not only in Germany, but in other countries, that the deep-rooted anti-Semitism that had already existed should be escalated to actually wipe Jews off the face of the earth. It is the worst genocide in human history. It's actually where the word genocide comes from. And as we reflect and honor those who stood up for themselves in Warsaw, and remember with reverence those who perished, we need to also come to terms with the fact that today, not only in Canada, but around the world, we're seeing the greatest explosion of anti-Semitism since the 1930s. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is more a reflection of, and it's sad that I have to do this. It's sad that normally when we be commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto and the Uprising, and looking back into the past and that horrible time when anti-Semitism fermented itself into a deathly cult, that we have to talk about what's happening today. But we do. And so let's reflect on a few things. Number one, most Jewish people that are listening to this are living with a dual trauma. The first trauma happened on October the 7th, when terrorist group Hamas launched a pogrom against Israel. Over 1,200 people murdered, including 8 Canadians. When I visited Israel in November, along with a bipartisan group of MPs and Jewish community leaders from across the country, we went to the South. We talked to the people who had lived through the experience. We saw blood and houses that were ransacked. We smelled the acrid smoke where people had been burned to death in their homes, like Vivian Silver, a peace activist from Winnipeg, who drove people from the Gaza border to hospitals in Israel, and she just died being burned to death in her safe room. We talked to people who had struggled with terrorists trying to open the door to their safe room because the safe rooms were built to protect Jews from missiles, not from terrorists in their houses, and they don't have locks. We talked to people who not only witnessed horror, but were sitting in their safe rooms on WhatsApp chat groups and suddenly saw their relatives, their sons, their daughters, their parents, their friends disappear over the course of the day from the chat, never knowing what happened, whether they were murdered, kidnapped, or just hurt. And the lack of intelligence by Israel, who would have ever thought that Israel would be in a position where something like this could happen? One of the contracts between the state of Israel and its people was that Jews in Israel wouldn't be subject to pogroms. And yet this happened. And the response, it was a shock to Israelis, a shock to Jews around the world, followed by the greatest upsurge in anti-Semitism that the world has ever seen. Let's start by the fact that Israel in October was faced with a situation where they saw Hamas as a true threat, not just an existential threat, but a true threat to the life and security of Israelis. And people on the center, the right, and the left all agreed that if Hamas was not wiped out, eradicated from power in Gaza, there would be another pogrom in Israel tomorrow, next week, next year. Hamas's own charter called for the destruction of Israel and, by the way, for harming Jews around the world. When Hamas did its day of action in November, it called on its supporters to target Jews everywhere. So living in the diaspora, supporting Israel, seeing the unfair treatment of Israel in the UN and other agencies, we feel hurt. But what is even more hurtful is what's happened on our shores. One of the things that I think we need to recognize when it comes to anti-Semitism, before I get into the demonstrations that we're all going to talk about, is that anti-Semitism exists on the left and the right. It forms a perfect concentric circle where the same tropes and the same ideological views are held by people from both ends of the spectrum. Now, the tropes may be different sometimes. On the left, it's about Israel and Zionists, and on the right, it's about Jews trying to, bring people of color into our societies and remove white people from power. But in the end, it all is the same. I co-chair an international task force of parliamentarians dealing with online anti-Semitism, and the vast majority of anti-Semitism starts online and then moves into our streets. And the anti-Semitism online, often that you see in your feeds on TikTok, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, doesn't come from your friends and your neighbors and your countrymen in Canada. It comes from countries that are our enemies. It comes from bots in Russia. It comes from Iran. It comes from places that want to sow division internally in countries like Canada and the United States by driving us apart. And so anti-Semitism is something that our enemies are using to divide our country, and everyone needs to know that. The second thing that's really important to understand for everyone is that anti-Semitism is a danger to our democracy and to our Constitution. Why is that? It's because the biggest trope, the biggest, most common anti-Semitic trope is that Jews control the world. There's a lot of other delightful tropes out there, such as that we're more loyal to Israel than our own country, and I can go on. But the trope that Jews control the world, which again exists on the right, exists on the left, is incredibly dangerous because it means that it doesn't matter what you decide in democratic elections. It doesn't matter if our elections are fair or if we believe in them. It doesn't matter who's in government or whether we should respect government and their decisions, because whatever it is, they're controlled by the Jews. And so why bother following the Constitution? Why bother following the rule of law if all that it yields is Jewish dominance and control? And this is a true danger to our lives, not just to Jews, but to everyone. My last comment that I'm going to make before I go into the demonstrations and what I see is wrong and that we should be doing is that Jews cannot allow anti-Semitism to define us. Too many of us, and a lot of Jews in Canada, live in Jewish neighborhoods. We talk to one another, and we don't really talk to people who aren't Jewish, and we're consumed by the issue of anti-Semitism. We live it day in, day out, because everybody's talking about it all the time. And most of our countrymen are not consumed by it the way we are. But we're Jews because we believe in tikkun olam. We believe we have a duty to repair the world, not only for ourselves, but for others. Of course, anti-Semitism is a huge issue and we need to fight it and we need to do everything we can. But we are proud Canadians. We've built this country. We've been here since 1760, in some cases for 10 generations. And we care about our fellow Canadians and Americans. We cannot allow our soul, our values to be changed because we're afraid. And that to me is a really important lesson. And the last thing that I'm going to say before I get into what's bad, these are not the 1930s. Yes, anti-Semitism is at a level we haven't seen since the 1930s, but it is not the 1930s. It's not governments that are putting forward a policy of anti-Semitism. Governments are simply confused about how to react, which has caused an immense amount of disappointment to us at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the federal level. But it's not because they're anti-Semitic. That's a very, very big word that we shouldn't throw around without the utmost caution. And so we live in a country, in Canada, where there's one of the lowest rates of anti-Semitism in the world. When Pew does its studies, which it does in countries around the world, only about 9 to 11% of Canadians have anti-Semitic tendencies. So today we're seeing a large protest. We're seeing a loud, angry mob, but they do not represent the vast majority of our fellow citizens or of our political leadership from any party. And that's really important. Canada and our neighbors are with us. They may not know how to handle it, but they support us. So Jews are not powerless. We're much stronger in Canada than we were in the 1930s. We have 9 Jews in the House of Commons. We have 3 in the Senate. We've had 3 Jews at one point together on the Supreme Court. This is not the 1930s. But what is like the 1930s is that we see mobs in Canada screaming things that are deeply offensive to Jews. And we see nobody stepping up and making clear from the mayors, from the premiers, and from the prime minister and the opposition leaders what police should be doing, which is that police have an obligation not just to stand there as innocent bystanders at these demonstrations, but to actively police. And when they do, we as the political level will support them. We will support them in arresting people when they break the law. We will support them in prosecuting people when they choose to prosecute. And that has been missing, and that's what the police are waiting for. They're waiting for their mayors to tell them to do this, and they're waiting for their attorney generals of the provinces to set out clear rules, and they're waiting for leadership. There are people amongst us who are trying very hard to get out these messages, but they need to be louder, they need to be more, and you need to hear them. So what's wrong with these protests? Because of course in Canada, demonstrations are a democratic right. And while of course we all agree that Jewish institutions in Canada, where Jews have no control over the actions of Israel, should not be targeted, it's not illegal to demonstrate outside of a synagogue or Jewish community center. But just because it's not illegal doesn't mean that they should do it. It's incredibly offensive. It's actually anti-Semitic. But we can't stop it, and the police can't stop it, and the government can't stop it from happening. what the police can do and must do is create buffers. In Montreal, in the week that I'm filming this, on Monday night at our Federation building that also houses the Holocaust Museum and the Jewish Public Library, there was an event where there were some members of the IDF that were speaking. And a protest surrounded the building on private property on the sidewalk of Federation, and the police didn't intervene properly. There were people blocking access into the building, so stopping people from hearing a speaker. There were other people that were held trapped in the building for several hours before the police cleared people away. And that is illegal. You cannot demonstrate and block people from accessing or leaving a building. You also cannot use your free speech rights to take away other people's free speech rights. When you stop me from attending an event that I want to attend in a Jewish building or from going to services in a synagogue, you're taking away my rights, and police should not be allowing that. And so, to me, these demonstrations are, number one, something that have not been adequately policed, and number two, have not been adequately castigated by leadership, by politicians. Because where things are not illegal is not the line that politicians need to use for condemnation. Yes, as a government, as police, you can't arrest people for chanting things that are hateful. They'd have to cross the line into hate speech. So for example, if you say all Jews should be killed, then you've crossed the line into hate speech and the person should be arrested. If you simply are yelling things that we find hateful, like antifada, antifada, and from the river to the sea, that we interpret as being calls for genocide against Jews or calls for the eradication of Israel, that's not a question of police intervention, but it is a question of politicians condemning that. Because if you're really calling for peace, you want a ceasefire in the Middle East, a lasting peace and a two-state solution, you don't have to yell revolution, revolution, and you don't have to yell from the river to the sea. And politicians should be reminding Canadians that good citizens don't just look at whether they can be arrested before they yell something. They also should look at what they're yelling makes other people feel. And it is clear to the people in these demonstrations that the slogans they're using are hateful to Jews, that the Jewish community interprets them badly. So why would they continue to use these slogans and try to yell them in our faces when it is so hurtful to us? They should not be doing that, and they should be condemned for doing that. So because maybe if everybody from all sides of the spectrum condemned that kind of chant, they would not use it anymore. And so it's been a frustrating time for all of us. And most certainly it's been a frustrating time for students at our campuses. There's no place in the country that I think is more insecure than the life of a Jewish student or a Jewish faculty member at a university in Canada these days. Not to mention that on social media, where most of our young people are, many of them, the vast majority of them, have lost friends because they see people that they thought were their friends posting anti-Israel posts and posting things that are hurtful to our young Jewish community members. And that's a horrible thing to go through when you're 18, 19, 20 years old and living away from home at the first time at a college campus. So I did two things. Number one, I put a motion before the Justice Committee that I sit on to call for hearings on anti-Semitism with a focus on what's happening on college campuses. I hope by the time that you're hearing this, that motion will have been adopted and our hearings will have started. But number two, what I also did was I got 4 other members of parliament to join with me, and we wrote a letter to Canada's 29 biggest universities, every university that has more than 20,000 people. So for example, in Toronto, University of Toronto, York, Metropolitan University, and we asked them a series of questions about how they were dealing with anti-Semitism on campus and what steps they were taking to look at their code of conduct, to improve it, to protect their Jewish students. And the very first question we asked them was the question that Elise Stefanik asked at the American congressional hearings to the presidents of MIT, Penn, and Harvard, which is, if there is a call for the genocide of Jews at your university, is it a violation of your code of conduct? In that case, at the US hearings, which by the way were absolutely bipartisan, they were supported by Democrats and Republicans, all three college presidents couldn't say that the call for the genocide against Jews was a violation of their code of conduct. They all said it depended on context. I'm pleased to say, with the pressure we put on our universities, all 29 responded in writing that a call for genocide against Jews would be a violation of their code of conduct, irrespective of context. 8 of them also confirmed that a call for the eradication of Israel would be a violation of their code of conduct, irrespective of context. And so what we've done, in addition to following up with Universities Canada, which is the umbrella group for the large universities, and through our pressure, convened 4 meetings of the universities on anti-Semitism to help them answer our letter and to move them forward on the path to improving things. We have been successful in getting those letters up on a website, conveyed to all the Hillel groups and Jewish students organizations across the country, to enable them to use them at each school when the school is not following what they promised us in their letter. And this week I met with a new group of Jewish students, the Canadian Union of Jewish Students. Following what exists in the UK and Europe and in America, we're creating a national organization of Jewish students in addition to Hillel that will lobby for Jewish students across the country. And that's really important. And as an MP, I'm showing you what one lone MP can do. And so I encourage each of you to reach out to your MP on these issues that you're concerned about and push. And not only your MP, your MPP in Ontario and your mayor and councillor, and to tell them that we need better policing at demonstrations. We need Jews not to be scared to go to our institutions. We need anti-Semitism to be treated with the seriousness and the rigor that it deserves to be treated with. And that we as Jews who have lived here and built this country since 1760 have a right to live in peace and freedom and equality in our country. So I am so honored to have had this opportunity to join with you as we talk about what happened 81 years ago, but also to work together to defeat the scourge that's in our midst, and to hopefully next year, when we're all back together, anti-Semitism will be reduced to what it used to be, an issue that we're concerned about, but doesn't consume us each and every day.
Neshames von jüdischer Stadt, behalten in die Palmeten von Ewigkeit. Und sie aufstehen von Toll, von Teut, wird auf sie ablosten die Sehung von Leben. Nur du, mein Gott, weißt, wie stark sie seinen gewähren, weil du hast sie gebeugt mit ein verstandiger Gwure. Nur du, mein Gott, hast gewusst, wie schwach sie seinen gewähren, eder sie seinen erweckt mit dem Räuch. Du hast nicht geschützt, die jüdische Stadt, sie nicht verfestigt, seinen See wie die heilige Oisius abgesprungen von Leben. Jetzt hängen Possele Nemmen auf Beistidlen von Wüste Wegen, alle Grenzen von dein Welt seinen Tome. kommen die Neshames von jüdischen Städten weinen von Kisse Hakobet. Gott, Baruch Hu, sehr wie grindlich Chorb wir seinen. Du hast uns erschaffen in dein Gestalt, jetzt ist dein Welt ein Stück Guf, Adomen. Die Getzflecker klingen jetzt die Namen von Städten. Warschau, Wilna, Chelm, Lublin. In Tag, wenn ich will bauen mein Haus, auf vergessen will ich in die jüdische Stadt, so verstummt werden mein Zung und vertreuerigt werden die Hand, was beut Gottes Haus auf dem Berg, auf ein Fundament von so viel vergessen ist. Verworren der Schlaf, der nicht Rimmler und nicht Schlafer, lässt sich vorlehnen die gestorbenen Namen von die heilige jüdische Stadt. Schmeckt der Semmelmehl von seiner Jüdischkeit. Es geht auf Errechnung, was hat sich abgetan von der ganzen Welt. Es weinen tausende Kinderschiere.
Let us remember our brothers and sisters, their cities and villages, the town's noisy streets, the lonely village inn, the distinguished old man, a young girl with her braids, an infant, all of the Jewish communities with their thousands of families, a whole Jewish existence sentenced to death on the European continent by the Nazi executioner, the sudden outcry of a man who died, the woman who cradled her baby till her arms dropped, the infant seeking its mother's breast when it was cold and blue, the feet, those feet trying to escape but could not, fists full of steel, the steel becoming weapons of despair, visions, and rebellion. Those heroes of the heart, open-eyed, daring, gave their lives but could not gain a victory. Let us remember the day at noontime when the sun gazed down on the slaughter from high in the silent sky. Let us remember the pile of ashes under the blossoming gardens and the dead who stare at us. They look from all sides, calling out for revenge. And let us, with our lives, bear witness and be their memorial.
Unter die polishe grininke beymelekh spielen sich mehr nit keyn moishalech shloimalech spielen sich mehr nit kein soralech lealech nit auf kein gräserlech nit auf kein schneealech Schilchen schein mehr nit die jüdische Stiemelech von die Kundesimlech, Motelech, Schimelech, nit die zerkrellte, zidrapete Zuralech, von dem Beweisen, von der ihm und Gwuralech. Streuer natzint, die polische beymelekh toit seinen jiddische heimen und heymelekh toit seinen gesselech choref die heiselech wo es verstechen sich Kinder wie heiselech jiddische Kinder mit große Egelech schwarze Hasoi wie mit Reuschech verzeugene Egeler voller mit Pachet verlorenen unter dem Unglück dem Bräunem getroffenen unter die polische grininke beymelekh spielten sich mehr nit kein moishalech shloimalech spielten sich mehr nit kein
Ich zind mein Treuer wie Yortzeitlichter, noch eich martierer, heilige Gesichter, Yortzeitlich noch mein Heim. Wie die Kedoshim, ihr seid gestorben. Mit euch wird leuchten unser Morgen, ihr wird keinmal nicht vergehen. Wie der Phönix von die Stäuben, von Asch sich wieder aufgehäuben, so wird ihr aufgehen. Von die Oyfns, von die Flammen, von dritten Hurben aufgestanden, mein Volk wird nicht vergehen. Du, mein Kind, du wirst mich erben. Ein Volk darf leben und nicht sterben. Ich schreibe für dir das Lied. Du sollst dem vor dem weiter spinnen. Mein Volk soll wachsen und soll grinen. Gedenk, du bist der Jid. Du, mein Kind, von Stamm a Zweigel. Vor mein Dor du sollst, nicht schweigen. Gedenk die Nazi-Schlang. Unser Volk wird sich zerzweigen, mit neuer Gewürge widersteigen in sein Heldengang.
Es zieht sich durch endlose Deures und zieht, der gewaltige Völkergeschleck. Es zittert das Schlachtfeld mir unter die Tritt, ich gehe mir als weiter mein Weg. Durch Samt und durch Derner, durch Stein und durch Bein, ich gehe und ich will noch ausgehen. Ich hab mit den Sotten Hamaschkes allein geschlossen an ewigen Bund. Das Feuer, es soll mich nicht brennen. Das Wasser, es soll mich nicht schlingen. Der Spie soll mich stechen nicht kennen. Die Keul soll zurück von mir springen. Ich fühl, ich bin stärker von allen Jesuren, von menschlicher Bösheit und Streit, und stärker von Wasser, von Feuer, von Sturm, und stärker a vielu von Zeit. Es seien von mir durch die tausender Jahren die Maluches die Gräste gegangen verloren, die Völker die stärkste vertilgt geworden, und Weltstädte zerackert in Salz. Und riesige Berg seinen lang schon zerschotten, und ewige Wälder zerfeult und zertrotten, und mächtige Felsen zerweicht und zerknotten. Ich leb und gedeih noch aus. Ich leb und ich will noch ausleben durch tausende Jahren von Streit. Ich will noch ausleben und kämpfen und streben, und Temp ist der Zorn von der Zeit.
Himl auf die Grenze im letzten Weg, euch immer neue, verstellen neue Weg. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird auch heute unser Volk, wir sein ein Lob. Blumen werden auf unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird auch heute unser Volk, wir sein ein Lob. Baumland des weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Kleid, unser Weg. Und ungebaut ist das Schloss von unser Blut. Schlossen wird auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Und ungebaut ist das Schloss von unser Blut. Schlossen wird auf unser Blut, unser Blut. Die Wolken sind vergilben uns der Heim, und der Merken wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Der Eufer sammeln wird die Sonne in Kajor, die Farvos und jenes Lied von dort zu go. Der Eufer sammeln wird die Sonne in Kajor, die Farvos und jenes Lied von dort zu go. Das Lied geschrieben mit Blut und nicht mit Wein. Es ist nicht ein Leben ohne Freude läuft der frei. Das Opfer kommt zwischen Frauen mit Gewinn. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Hände. Das Opfer kommt zwischen Frauen mit Gewinn. Das Lied gesungen nimmt Vergangenes in die Hände. Das soll nicht immer als Vergessen wird besten Weg. Von Stimmen meine verstellen, wo ihr fehlt. Trugen wir weg auf unser Haus gewählte